As dawn rose upon the 1700s, so too did it on the 100th anniversary of the English East India Company. Over the course of a century, the company, founded by a band of pirate adventurers, evolved into an extremely successful international enterprise. It had far outpaced its peers and became known ubiquitously to the British people as John Company. Although its ventures in Indonesia and Japan had not panned out, its footholds in India were generating fabulous wealth for its shareholders, and the company would evolve from a success story to a tale of rapacious infamy. The mighty Mughal Empire had long kept the European traders in India confined to their small outposts, but as the imperial lion grew sick, the directors of the so-called Honourable Company would begin their transition from merchants to conquerors. Welcome to our second video on the history of the British East India Company, in which we will describe how John Company built its massive private army and initiated its colonial conquest of India with the seizure of Bengal.
Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible.
In May of 1707, the Acts of Union joined the kingdoms of England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain, incidentally evolving the English East India Company into the British East India Company. 3 months later, Emperor Aurangzeb died at the age of 88, concluding a 49-year rule. His reign had seen the Mughal Empire reach its territorial zenith, but left its armies and treasury depleted. Taking advantage of the central government's weakness, hereditary Nawab lords throughout India severed the threads of Mughal vassalage, paying lip service to an increasingly toothless series of emperors, but running their domains as functionally independent realms. From the central Deccan Plateau, the Hindu Marathas exploded onto the scene, carving out a vast territory throughout India, capturing the Mughal capital of Delhi and reducing the Mughal emperor to a puppet. It was upon this politically fragmented battleground that a private corporation, headquartered in a small London office, would destroy all its competition and emerge as the imperial overlords of over 200 million people. At the beginning of the 18th century, the East India Company possessed only 3 meagre security corps stationed in the enclaves of Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. Initially, these corps were nothing more than a small and unimpressive hodgepodge of European mercenaries, whose duties were limited to defending the small territorial outposts the company held. However, as the 18th century progressed, the East India Company rapidly developed a professional standing army. By the turn of the 19th century, this corporate paramilitary had grown to twice the size of the regular British Army and become far larger than the armed forces of most other European nations. It should be noted that the army of the East India Company was nonetheless integrated with the regular British Army. By the end of the 18th century, the company was paying their state counterparts to garrison a select few regiments in India. Moreover, the company relied on the British Royal Navy to protect its vital shipping lanes across the Indian Ocean, although it also possessed a respectable fleet. The core of its private land army consisted of soldiers recruited back home. Yet, despite the colossal size its military would later grow to, John Company always struggled to recruit British citizens, as it was generally considered more respectable to take the king's shilling than to join a private paramilitary. Consequently, The European regiments of the East India Company's armies were small and perennially understaffed. However, they more than made up for this shortcoming in Indian recruits. These native troopers were known as sepoys and were armed, dressed and trained in the same fashion as the British redcoats. The East India Corporation never had any problems filling its lower ranks with indigenous soldiers, drawing upon long-standing Indian martial traditions to portray service in their corporate army as honourable and prestigious. This, alongside the promise of land grants, pensions and decent pay, made John Company an attractive employer to indigenous Indians across a variety of religions and castes. As historian Ian Barrow summarises, "It is one of the great ironies of the company's history that its Indian empire was effectively won by Indian troops." With all that said, British supremacy in the Indian subcontinent was by no means a foregone conclusion. Practically every major Indian power they fought was also capable of raising massive armies and keeping up with European military technology. Consequently, diplomacy and subterfuge played a major role, securing key allies among various Indian states, such as Hyderabad and Gwalior, as well as sowing internal discord within hostile nations. The next factor which gave John Company an edge was money. Standing armies are extremely costly to maintain, and even more so to keep in the field, a lesson the Mughals learned the hard way after Aurangzeb's campaigns in the Deccan depleted his treasury, starting a long decline. In contrast, the East India Company's large pool of private investors, along with its innovations in taxation and banking, enabled it to raise vast sums of money at a moment's notice. In that regard, the British megacorporation emerged triumphant in almost any conflict through economic attrition. The first major wars that the corporation engaged in were the latest chapter in an old rivalry. Like the English, the French had been relative latecomers to the game of colonization. However, by the mid-18th century, the fleur-de-lis had carved out an ocean-spanning empire that extended from North America to the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. The French presence in India mirrored the British, spearheaded by a private joint stock corporation known as the Compagnie d'Inde, whose centre of operations was the trade port of Pondicherry. By the 1740s, the French Compagnie in India had built up a formidable private army, consisting of professionally trained sepoy regiments recruited from the Tamil, Malayali and Telugu-speaking regions of India. The British and French companies were inevitably drawn into conflict whenever Britain and France went to war. The result of this was the Carnatic Wars, 3 conflicts that served as extensions of the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, and featured the British and French companies fighting for southeastern India. The Carnatic Wars were remarkable for being part of the first truly global conflicts in world history. For instance, when Madras was conquered by the French in 1746, it was returned in exchange for Louisbourg, a French fort that British forces had captured in Atlantic Canada, over 13,000 kilometers away. They were also notable for facilitating the rise of Robert Clive, the man many consider singularly responsible for beginning the British conquest of India. Signing on with the company in 1744, the young officer's meteoric rise to prominence began in 1751 during the Second Carnatic War, a proxy conflict largely fought between the French-aligned Carnatic and the British-aligned Hyderabad. With Hyderabad rapidly losing ground, Clive made a bold stab at the Carnatic capital of Arcot, with little more than 1,000 company troops and sepoys, capturing the city and subsequently holding it against a French and Carnatic relief force that outnumbered his own 7-1. In 1754, the Treaty of Pondicherry elevated the British-backed Muhammad Ali Walaya of Hyderabad to the Nawabship of the Carnatic, making the British the predominant European power in southern India. When news of this unlikely victory reached London, British Prime Minister William Pitt hailed Clive as a heaven-born general. The Second Carnatic War concluded just in time. No sooner had the company contained the French threat to Madras than a new danger emerged, this time poised against the company's outpost at Calcutta. Straddling the banks of the Hooghly River, Calcutta served as the company's primary enclave in Bengal, a region which had come under the rule of an independent Nawab named Alivadi Khan. Alivardi Khan was soon beset upon by the surging Marathas, who scourged the land with the horrifying efficiency of the Mongols from centuries past. The Nawab of Bengal eventually paid the Marathas off with a huge indemnity, emerging from this conflict with a realm that had been desolated and economically devastated. To rebuild, Alivardi was forced to impose heavy taxation on merchants in his lands. These included not only the British traders in Calcutta, but also the Dutch and the French, who also had factories along the Hooghly. The Europeans grumbled mightily at their shakedown at the hands of their Bengali host, but cooler heads on both sides managed to keep tensions from rising beyond a simmer. Unfortunately, hostilities intensified after Alivardi Khan's death in 1756, and his son, Siraj ud-Dawla, succeeded him as Nawab of Bengal. Depicted by both European observers and his very own kinsmen as hot-headed, volatile and paranoid, the new Nawab expressed open resentment of the considerable economic influence that the European factories on the Hooghly had over his realm. When the Europeans responded to the Nawab's provocative rhetoric by fortifying the defences of their Bengal factories, Siraj demanded they cease. The French obeyed, but the British refused. In June of 1756, Siraj descended upon British Calcutta at the head of a mighty host, overrunning the local garrison and reducing the city from a bustling trade entrepot into a scorched wasteland. This body blow against the company necessitated a powerful retaliation, and the man for the job was none other than the so-called heaven-born general, Robert Clive. In the winter of 1756, Clive sailed up the Hooghly with a squadron of warships, a contingent of around 2,000 troops, and an endless repository of reckless audacity. The bold company officer blasted away the Bengali force occupying Calcutta and retook the city before ambushing and wreaking havoc among Nawab's 40,000-strong army of reinforcements as they camped along the riverbank. Siraj was cowed into suing for peace, signing the Treaty of Alinagar on February the 9th and allowing the English to reclaim and fortify Calcutta. This peace would not last, for by 1757, the 7 Years' War was in full swing. In India, this manifested as the third and final Carnatic War, in which Robert Clive attacked and conquered the French fort of Chandernagore on the Hooghly. Hoping to exploit the conflict between the British and the French to his advantage, the Nawab of Bengal began making overtures with the French Compagnie against their common English enemy. Word of this soon reached Calcutta, and another war between the British Company and the Bengali prince became inevitable. Siraj had picked a bad time to choose another fight, as unbeknownst to him, the walls were closing in on his regime. Many of the ministers and generals who had loyally served Alivardi Khan had had enough of his son's volatile rule. They formed a faction to depose him under the leadership of a veteran general named Mir Jafar. It did not take long for Mir Jafar and his conspirators to make contact with Clive. On June 12, 1757, both parties met secretly in person and cemented the terms of their collaboration. Clive would help place Mir Jafar on the Bengali throne, and in return, the East India Company would receive a massive payout and substantial commercial privileges. 1 day later, Clive declared war on the Nawab of Bengal for a second time. On the 23rd of June, a company force of just 3,000 men engaged with a 60,000-strong Bengali army outside a village known to the natives as Plassey and to the English as Plassey. Immortalized in the history books as the event which truly kick-started the British colonization of India, the Battle of Plassey was less of a battle than it was a financial transaction. Little actual combat took place before Mir Jafar abandoned the field with the vast majority of the Bengali host, leaving Siraj ud-Dawla out to dry. The ill-fated prince was forced to flee and was later captured by Mir Jafar's men and executed. After the battle, Mir Jafar travelled to the British camp at Daudpur, where he was welcomed heartily by Robert Clive and declared the new Nawab of Bengal. The Battle of Plassey did not result in the immediate British annexation of Bengal, yet the East India Company now wielded immense financial leverage over the new Nawab, and utilised that leverage to gain more and more control over Bengali politics. Feeling increasingly constricted by his ostensible British allies, Mir Jafar began trying to shake them off by any means necessary. His attempt at an alliance with the Dutch East India Company failed when the British East India Company defeated the corporate forces of their Hollander counterparts in the 1759 Battle of Chinsura, underscoring the rising supremacy of England's John Company and the slow decline of the Netherlands' Jan Company. In 1763, the 7 Years' War concluded with a decisive British victory and the effective end of the First French colonial empire. The French presence in India would linger for a few more decades. Still, they were no longer a factor in Bengal, and neither they nor the Dutch were capable of forming a wedge against a total British takeover of the region. In 1764, Mir Jafar's son, Mir Qasim, allied with the Nawab of neighbouring Awadh and the remnants of the Mughal Empire in a last-ditch attempt to drive out the East India Company for good. The subsequent Battle of Buxar resulted in a decisive company victory, dashing away the last hopes of an independent Bengal. In August 1765, the impoverished Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II formally granted the British control over tax collection in Bengal. This symbolic act by the defeated figurehead of a faded empire provided legitimacy to the new reality. The entirety of Bengal now belonged to a small corporate office on Leadenhall Street in London. The conquest of Bengal was the British East India Company's first major step into true imperial domination. Within the span of a few years, the corporation had evolved from the administrators of a handful of trading outposts to the foreign overlords of over 30 million native Indians in a territory nearly 240,000 square kilometers in size. Thereafter, the first company-appointed governors of Bengal immediately embarked on one of the most disastrous sprees of corruption, exploitation, and mismanagement in world history. While India's previous conquerors, such as the Mughals, had no doubt performed their fair share of persecution and butchery, they nonetheless invested considerably in the culture, economy, and infrastructure of their newly conquered domains. In contrast, the British East India Company had no stake in the proper governance of Bengal, only in stripping it bare and transferring its wealth to England. It's no coincidence that the word loot derives from the Hindu word lut, meaning to rob or to plunder, and first entered the English dictionary in the 18th century. Nor, by extension, is it a surprise that 300 years later, the single largest collection of Indian artifacts in the world is found in Wales's Powys Castle, which hosts the private collection of the Clive family. The loss of cultural heritage is a tragedy, but the loss of human life is immeasurable, and the first years of company rule in India presided over both. In 1770, an apocalyptic famine reaped a bloody harvest throughout Bengal, claiming as many as a staggering 10 million lives. Much like the British government during the Irish Potato Famine, or the Soviets during the Holodomor, the East India Company has been widely criticised by historians for accelerating the death toll during the Bengal famine, by not only neglecting to set up relief measures, but doubling down on their exploitation of an already suffering population. It is a common cliché in the discussion of history that the figures of the past should not be judged by the standards of our time. Yet, even back in the 18th century, large swathes of the British public were horrified by John Company's rapacious appetites. Throughout his tenure as the company governor of Bengal, Robert Clive was subject to widespread attacks by the press and in Parliament for his conduct in India. One London satire described Clive as a Lord Vulture, who was utterly deaf to every sentiment of justice and humanity. Beset upon by critics for the rest of his life, Clive of India spent the final years of his life in a state of depression, and died in 1774 after stabbing himself to death with a penknife. Clive was not the only company governor of Bengal to face legal scrutiny back home. One of his successors, Sir Warren Hastings, was put before the British House of Lords in 1788 in what has been described as the longest and perhaps most famous political trial in the history of the British Isles. Hastings, and by extension the corporation he worked for, stood accused of nothing less than, quote, "the rape of India, with injustice and treachery against the faith of nations. The prosecutor in this case was the renowned politician and philosopher Edmund Burke, who did not mince his words in condemning the entire British East India Company and the legacy it would leave upon future generations of Indians and Englishmen alike. "Every rupee of profit made by an Englishman is lost to India forever," Burke asserted. "Every other conqueror has left some monument behind him. Were we to be driven out of India this day, nothing would remain to tell that it had been possessed during the glorious period of our domination. The company appears more like an army going to pillage the people under the pretense of commerce than anything else. Their business is more like robbery than trade." The trial dragged on for 7 years, but Hastings was ultimately cleared of all charges in 1795. The result was ultimately unsurprising, for what the company had started in India was ultimately not something that could be stopped. In our next episode on the history of the British East India Company, we will continue to cover the mega-corporations' conquests across India as they go to war with the powerful Mysore Sultanate and Maratha Empire. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.